cedo la palabra a Mauricio Suárez.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. No sé si se me oye bien. ¿Se está funcionando, verdad, el micrófono bien? And maybe you would like to try to test the microphone.
Yes. Am I audible? Yes. Okay.
Perfecto. Bueno, es un gran placer estar aquí hoy.
Yo creo que no hace falta, creo que lo puedes hacer directamente en inglés.
¿Sí?
Y yo lo interpreto todo, pero es discutible.
¿Sí? Can we go straight into English? I will try to speak slowly and not even. I'll speak normally. So it is a great pleasure for me to be here today to introduce Lorraine Daston to this audience, and we're going to have a brief conversation about some of her books, some of her major contributions to the history and philosophy of science. And I had prepared a long introduction because her curriculum is very long, but she certainly doesn't need introduction for those of us who work in the history and philosophy of science. And she has asked me not to give a very long introduction anyway, so I would just say a few things about Lorraine Daston. She's one of the most influential historians of science alive. She has contributed in a major way to our understanding of the history of key concepts such as probability and chance, objectivity, most recently, the normativity of social life and the rules that operate in inquiry. She was trained in Harvard. She likes to remind me with an important and brief spell in Cambridge, which was formative in different ways. And then for a long time, she was the director of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, where she is now director emerita of that center. She's also a visiting professor and for a long time member of faculty at the Committee for Social Thought at the University of Chicago. So she basically goes back and forth between Europe and North America. And as regards the kind of work that has touched and impacted most in the sort of work that I do, she was part of a very important, influential movement at the University of Bielefeld in the early 80s on the probabilistic revolution, a movement of scholars that changed completely the way we think about probability, both from a philosophical and a historical standpoint. Most recently, she has published a number of books. The one that I would like to talk most about today is this book called Rules, which I am told is about to be published in a version in Spanish by Alianza Editorial. I think as early as next month, this book will be available in translation in bookstores throughout the country. She has an even more recent book entitled Rivals. I can catch up with her, and I have not been able to read the last one. So we're going to focus particularly on rules. But I also want to say, if you can find it, the early work on probability is really groundbreaking. It has been groundbreaking for many of us who work in the field. So I made sure to bring the latest edition of her first book, Classical Probability and Enlightenment, which has a wonderful new preface and introduction to the book, very interestingly placing the book in the context of the time in which it was written. Now, I'd like to start our conversation maybe with a very general question about the role of history in our understanding of the present, and what is it that the study of the past can contribute to our understanding of the present? What would be your vision of the value of history as a scholarly enterprise for our understanding of the present.
First of all, thank you very much for that generous and short introduction. And my thanks to all of you for coming out in a rainstorm. For me, the role of history is to shape our sense of what is self-evident and what is not. So in every age, there are boundaries to what is thinkable and what is unthinkable. And what history does, at least the kind of history that I try to do, is to expand the boundaries of the thinkable and to explain how an idea that once did seem self-evident, in need of absolutely no justification, can become unthinkable, and vice versa. How something which was once unthinkable can become thinkable. Let me make that concrete with one example about probability. For most of the history of philosophy, an utterance is either true or false. There are only two possibilities. It's either true or it's false. Sometime in the middle of the 17th century, a spectrum opens up between those two binary possibilities of degrees of probability, degrees of belief. This is a completely new thought that for centuries before was not thinkable. That to me is an example of what history can do.
And maybe I should add to the question, if you have anything to say about how history and philosophy can contribute together in the clarification or elucidation of contemporary concepts. I mean, history makes the possibilities apparent. Is there a job for philosophy as well to do here in combination with history? And since we're going to be talking about intelligence and the normativity of intelligence, it may be interesting to start off by setting up the general relationship between history and philosophy.
You know, I mean, as you know, since Aristotle, the relationship between history and philosophy has not exactly been an easy one. Aristotle says that philosophy and poetry are superior to history because they're about universals and history is only about particulars. But I think the particulars of history, at very least, can expand the conceptual possibilities for philosophy. What it can't do is to adjudicate whether or not these concepts which we have lost, which are no longer thinkable, are apt for our time and our place. Mm-hmm. That's really the job of the philosophers. The other job of the philosophers is to come up with new concepts. It's very rare for a great poet to emerge in any generation. It's even rarer for a great metaphysician to emerge in any era. So we turn to the philosophers for the creativity to coin new concepts which were previously unthinkable. And if I may give, again, a concrete example, our concept of philosophical truth is one that we have inherited from Plato. It is a view about eternal, unchanging truths. A truth which changes from today till tomorrow is not a truth by that definition. And yet, the best example we have of reliable knowledge, scientific knowledge, is constantly changing. Mm-hmm. And we call that progress. We need the philosophers to come up with a new idea of truth that would do justice to scientific progress. So,
ball in your court.
Yes, well, I was just going to say that indeed it seems to me that the very concept of probability also has a history, and it was invented at a certain point and a certain time in order to answer a number of very specific needs and requirements, and it was invented by philosophers in that famous debate between Pascal and Fermat that you know so well, but many other contributors. So indeed new concepts are brought into being all the time. Just focusing a little bit more on the content of the book, I wanted you to tell us something a little bit about your tripartite conception of rules. In the book, Lorraine Daston defends the view that historically one can distinguish three semantic clusters for the notion of rule that have played a role in inquiry throughout from ancient times. And one of them is associated with algorithms and calculations. Another one of them is associated with laws, and a third one is associated with models. And this is very intriguing because we no longer recognize it as one. I'd like you to tell us a bit more about what is important about these three semantic clusters, how do they interrelate, and in particular, what is it about the models understanding of rules that is new, innovative, and relevant today?
So this book, I must say, is a kind of insane project. I started out to write a history of rules, all of them everywhere. This is the kind of project that you end up in a lunatic asylum if you begin it. So I attempted to give it some kind of structure and also to set boundaries to it by looking at the definitions of rules, the understandings of what a rule could be that were the most ancient and also the most long-lived. And as Mauricio just said, 2 out of these 3 semantic clusters, meanings of rules, are very familiar to us. We would immediately recognize the rules of calculation and measurement that sometime in around the 10th or 11th century started to be called algorithms, and the first and still prototypical algorithms are just the simple operations of arithmetic: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So that's one ancient meaning. Another ancient meaning is, again, very familiar to us, and that is the laws which are promulgated by some authority, usually with sanctions attached if the laws are violated. These are as ancient as our sources go back, and they're still very much with us. But there's a third meaning, which is the rule as a model, which, although I think it still very much exists in our understanding of rules, has disappeared from the dictionaries, has disappeared from philosophical and historical understandings of what a rule is, and that is the rule as a model. And perhaps the easiest way to explain this, especially for those of you who have or have had young children, is to think about how young children learn the rules of their culture. We don't give a 2 or a 3-year-old a charter, a book of rules that they should follow, things they should do, things they shouldn't do. Rather, the child learns by imitating, emulating older siblings, parents, friends, teachers. That is, it learns the rules of the culture by following a model. Yet this meaning of rules, which has its last grand scene in Kant's Third Critique at the end of the 18th century, by the middle of the 19th century has entirely disappeared. And one of the aims of the books is to try to understand why that happened. Why did we lose such an ancient and still useful idea of what a rule is?
Thank you. And if I may add to that, those of you who will run out of this event when it's over into the bookstore and try to get this book, Rules, I advise you to look at the sections on life in the abbey and the role of the abbot in medieval times as a rule for life in the abbey, and therefore embodying this conception of rules as models or exemplifying instances that can then guide behavior in all kinds of different ways. It's a wonderful description, historical description of life in an abbey, in a medieval abbey, and it's full of detail, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. It's a really wonderful description. Now, I wanted to move on, getting closer to the notion of intelligence and the varieties and different forms of human intelligence. Another aspect of the book that I found extremely revealing, I learned so much from the book about this, concerns algorithms. Now, algorithms an ancient word with a very evident etymology. We tend to think we know what an algorithm is nowadays, just look at how a computer works. But in the book, you give us an analysis of how algorithms evolve from something that is in your terminology quite a thick rule into the contemporary very thin notion of an algorithm as something completely abstract and independent of context. And I was really amazed by the discussion of algorithms in the medieval times, in the pre-modern times, because it really is so different and distinct from our contemporary notion of algorithm, connected in many different interesting ways, but yet very distinct. And so therefore here there is perhaps a kind of human intelligence that is somehow related to the notion of algorithm. And if the notion of algorithm has changed throughout history, then perhaps our understanding of human intelligence has also co-varied with that change. And so perhaps you would like to comment on, on the...
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting connection that you draw, actually, because we're at a moment, of course, when the term artificial intelligence is on everyone's lips. And we think a lot about how human intelligence does and does not differ from artificial intelligence. And we think of artificial intelligence as being ultimately a matter of algorithms in the form of a computer program. But for the long, long history of mathematical traditions, and not only in Western cultures, but also in ancient India, in ancient China, in ancient Mesopotamia, algorithms are anchored to specific problems. And let me give you, again, a concrete example to make this vivid. The rule of three, which is a rule that you use, for example, if you're a medieval merchant and you are traveling from, let us say, Sevilla to Florence in Italy, and you have to deal with different measurements and different currencies. This is the simple rule that you use to convert your currency, your measurements into that of your destination. This is sometimes articulated as it would be in a modern mathematics textbook abstractly, algebraically, but mostly it's taught in terms of a concrete problem. So if you're learning this rule as a medieval merchant, you are solving many, many problems of concrete, specific problems of this form. And at some point, when you're presented with a brand new problem, you somehow by analogy have learned how to solve that problem. So it's a good example of how even in the realm of algorithms, in the realm of calculation, you use models. I don't know how many of you were taught mathematics, but I was taught mathematics in a frankly very similar fashion. For example, to solve two simultaneous equations and two unknowns, I was taught about a bathtub filling up at different rates. And to this day, if I have to solve those equations, I think, yes, that is a bathtub problem, and convert it back. So this is an example of how having a model problem is the way in which you learn algorithms, not just how to be a monk in a Benedictine monastery or to be a child who knows whether to kiss on both cheeks or to shake hands in a particular culture, but even in the realm of calculation. And I think this is interesting from the standpoint of intelligence, because our understanding of intelligence is, at the moment, very much linked to facility with algorithms in the sense of computer programs. But by far, in world history, throughout world cultures, the most frequent way of thinking about algorithms was in terms of models and analogy.
Thank you. I mean, there is this wonderful discussion of analogy from particulars that you have in the book as applied to algorithms and how they thin out as the history progresses. But I want to come back to the role of judgment in some of the applications of these analogical bits of reasoning. there's this beautiful description of the debate over the casuistry in the 17th century between Pascal and Boni on the one hand and the Jesuits on the other hand in the book. And a debate that, by the way, was thought to have been won by Pascal and by the defenders of high, exact, and thin rules. But there's a wonderful vindication in Lorraine's book of the role of casuistry, and to the point of making a case that it is relevant today. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see this ancient debate over casuistry spreading on to the present day, and how you see the notion of judgment that plays a role and the kinds of particular judgments that play a role in casuistry playing themselves out in our contemporary life. And if you can think of some examples where this may be brought to life in some way.
Again, it's very much like the question of the model, in that casuistry, as you say, since Pascal has had a very bad reputation. Just to refresh your memories, what Pascal does is to imagine a Jesuit who is so adept at twisting any possible sin or misdemeanor that is confessed to him so that almost anything can be forgiven. And Pascal, speaking through a fictional character, is scandalized by the laxness of the morality of the Jesuit. And ever since, as Mauricio says, casuistry has had a very bad reputation. But I think that casuistry, like the model, still survives, but it survives underground. It's no longer reputable to talk about it, but we practice it every day. And let me give an example. Every board of medical ethics at every hospital is making decisions every day about who gets an organ transplant. Spain is in the fortunate position of being the only country I know where this has been managed so well that there is not a critical dearth of organs for donation. But in every other country, certainly in Germany, there is a debate when an organ becomes available for transplantation as to who's going to get it. There are two ways of approaching this. One is just to have a rule of patients who need the organ, and you proceed down the list, and the person who's first on the list gets the organ. But what if the person who's first on the list is 80 years old, sick from many different ailments, will probably live not very long even if he or she gets the organ, and there's a young person in the hospital, a person perhaps of 14 or 15, who, if he or she got this organ, might live a long life. That's a classic case of casuistry. That's when you don't have a firm, clear rule to guide you. Instead, you have two principles. One principle of fairness, we just go by the list, but also a principle of, let us say, compassion and life possibilities. And what casuistry does is to deliberate when you have two principles that collide to try to figure out what to do in this specific case. I think we face that kind of decision, perhaps not with such grave consequences, all the time. And we are constantly in our heads having collisions of arguments. And that's what judgment is. Collisions of good arguments on both sides as we try to figure out what's the right thing to do in this case.
So what does that suggest to you that we should do with the classical concept of laws of nature, unifying powerful regularities that subsume all the phenomena that are clean, clear, consistent, and therefore cannot come into collision with any other system? Is that now a vision of nature, way that it operates and behaves, that is superseded? Or do we have to still keep some room for that and see it as interacting with this much more down-to-earth casuistry type of reasoning that constantly involves judgment. What is the relationship, you think, between the two?
One way of thinking about it is to think about the human versus the natural, but I think that would be too simple. I think there are definitely realms, and the cosmological is one of them, where that classical conception of laws of nature still holds, is still very serviceable. So probably the one rule that none of us have broken today is the law of gravity. But there are other realms of nature, not just of human affairs, where there are causal structures which are so delicate that laws of nature are very poor guides to prediction. So let me give an example. So you've probably all heard of the butterfly effect, which is the idea that a very, very small perturbation someplace in the Earth's climate system can cause thousands of kilometers away a cyclone or a typhoon. That's an example of one of these complex systems where you have a tiny cause that produces this immense cascade of effects. In those kinds of structures, in nature, there's nothing human about this. In those kinds of structures, natural laws are not a very good guide. Instead, we have, and this is your territory, we have very complicated models to try to predict what is going to happen. And these models are very sensitive to parameters, to initial parameters.
Yes, I mean, in fact, I am of the view, shared by some contemporary philosophers of science, that there are no such things as universal laws of nature except in models. There are very general models of general application that contain laws that describe a variety of different ways in which the phenomena can be. But there are nonetheless representations, and they ascribe this law-like behavior in the way in which any model does by means of suitable and suggesting analogies. So the idea, I think, amongst even philosophers of science, the idea that there are universal laws of nature that subsume all the phenomena, the all logical positivistic ambition to explain science as a succession of such laws, is, I think, now in many ways superseded. And most of us who study the practice of science see all these different patches of reality where different laws operate because different models are applicable in different places and for different domains of phenomena, different levels of emergence, and so on. So in fact, this is very much quite close to what you want to suggest in the book. And I think it brings us back to this notion of rules as models, in which analogical reasoning plays a critical role. Not in the sense of exemplifying behavior, but in the sense of embodying this sort of analogical reasoning. I wonder, this leads us to something that I really love about your work, which is this distinction between what you call human reason and rationality. Reason is what we employ pragmatically, the way I would put it, when we try to overcome some problem, bringing all kinds of elements of judgment to bear on particular cases. It's pretty thick in the terminology of the book. It applies to a context, and it changes from context to context. Rationality, on the other hand, is the attempt of philosophers and theorists to come up with a clean, thinner system of general abstract rules that inform what rationality is in every context. And there's a really nice interplay between these two notions in the book. And I would like to invite you to say a bit more about how you see this interplay and who is winning out. Is reason winning out, or is rationality winning out?
No, I'm afraid rationality is winning out. So it's helpful to explain to everyone how I ended up thinking of these two words, which are usually used in the languages I know, at least, as synonyms. I mean, it's rare to make a distinction between them. How I started thinking that they might be very different. I had the good fortune to be involved in a project about what happened to rationality during the Cold War. And it became really clear to me and to my colleagues that if you have nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons can be launched by a ballistic missile that can be halfway across the Earth in 30 minutes, that there is absolutely no time for you to deliberate, to use reason, to use argument. And therefore, what happened with both the Soviet Union and the United States is that they developed very algorithmic rules of rationality, which were rules like, if the Soviets attack Washington, we will automatically, there will be not a moment's hesitation, attack Moscow. That this is a form of rationality which makes it transparent what the consequences are of the action. And the hope was that knowing that there were these rules, these general rules that had no exceptions whatsoever that would be followed automatically, would act as a kind of détente and a kind of check to both sides trying to annihilate the other. That encapsulates this distinction between reason and rationality. Reason is the kind of decision we make when we're taking into account many different factors. And most of the interesting decisions that we have to make in life have to do with many different factors. When you decide whom you're going to marry, or whether or not you're going to move to a different city, it's very rare that you have just one criterion in mind. You have many criteria in mind, and what reason does is to create a kind of discussion in your head of many voices trying to figure out which reason you should weight most heavily and why. What rationality does is to give you a way of strict prioritizing of those criteria so that, let us say, if you're going to move to a new city, the only criteria is, will you earn more money in that city or not? Not whether or not you will be far away from family, not whether or not the climate is miserable, not whether or not the cost of living is high, but that one criterion. That is the kind of situation with a strict ordering of criteria where you can employ rationality. You can employ a rule that has no exceptions, no countervailing voices in your head. And that is a distinction which depends on the world being in a certain way. A complicated, unpredictable, unstable world needs reason. A predictable, stable, standardized, homogeneous world can get by with rationality.
And you think rationality is winning out because our world is becoming more standardized, more stable, more predictable?
No, I think that we think it is. I think that this is an illusion. I mean, remember the pandemic. Remember what happened during the pandemic, about how the supply chains snapped, how the airports were empty, how the trains no longer ran. Any world, even the most standardized, stable world, can, from one moment to the next, be turned upside down by some unpredictable event. And perhaps we should keep that in mind.
So it is actually, it's now striking me that the pandemic is a really good example of a moment where you have a crisis in rationality, evidently because reliability suddenly breaks down. But in the end, reason prevailed, you could say that, and we overcame the pandemic by means of science, by means of new social interactions and rules of social engagement. So it's one beautiful example, really, of a breakdown in rationality where reason comes to the rescue and gets us out of trouble.
I hope that was the case in Spain. I cannot say in the United States that reason always prevailed, but I very much want to believe that it was the case in Spain. So.
I mean, we had our difficult moments where I think neither reason nor rationality were prevailing, but in the end, I think we came through.
But it is a really good example because you'll remember, especially during the first months when nobody knew what the characteristics of this disease were.
Yes.
You know, how it could be, was it contagious by touch, by air? Who was most in danger? Was it small children or was it older people? And so this is a case where, you know, from moment to moment, as we learned more, we were changing our mind. That's a situation in which rationality, having formal rules, generalizable rules, are not very useful. There are other cases where it's very useful, but this was not one of them.
Yes, all kinds of certainties broke down, and the world became a much more unpredictable place, and indeed that really fits in with your story very well. I wonder if we can go back to the idea that judgments are the key that inform not only the way in which reason and reasonable behavior is applied, but also in your previous work with Peter Gallison. I'm struck that there is different notions of objectivity. This is a book entitled Objectivity, written by Lorraine, Daston, and Peter Gallison, major hallmark in the history of science, in which different conceptions of objectivity are distinguished. And one of these conceptions of objectivity has a very intimate link with judgment, and in particular with expert judgment. And perhaps we should say something about the role of experts and how they can help us apply reason best or better or worse, if it may be the case, by means of their very specific judgments. Do you think that we need experts, and how do we need them?
So it's interesting to think about the word expert, which shares the root with experience, both of them from Inteligencia. And what experts have is judgment that has been honed on a lot of examples in a particular domain. So when we consult a doctor, let's say a specialist for heart diseases, we expect the doctor to have seen a lot of different cases of heart disease and to use that experience. It's that experience which has sharpened judgment to be able to apply it to our particular case. And that kind of expert judgment is indispensable. And it's even indispensable in systems which are highly automated. So if you take an airplane flight these days, your pilot, frankly, is doing very little in the cockpit. Most of the system has been automated. But should something go wrong, should there be something unexpected, then it is extremely important that the pilot and the co-pilot be able to exercise expert judgment on the basis of experience in order to deal with the situation. There was a famous case not that long ago in which a plane took off from, I think, the New York airport, and birds, this sometimes happens, birds flew into the engine, which meant that the captain had to do something which was certainly not foreseen, which is to land on the Hudson River. That was a moment at which the automated system were totally useless, but the expert judgment of this very experienced pilot saved the situation. No one was killed, no one was injured.
Very nice. Maybe we should mention one final topic before I open up for questions from the public. And that's your final chapter in the book, which is really on political philosophy. And is devoted to the notion of the rule of law and the state of exception. And this fits into the narrative because rules as laws have this history and they develop in increasingly thinner ways, but suddenly we have breakdowns of the domain of the rule of law and states of exception have to be enacted. And there are different accounts of how best to deal with those moments. And I wonder if you would like to say something about how intelligence and reason may prevail. We may be able to help them prevail in cases in which there is a breakdown in the rule of law or some sort of exception.
So, yeah, let me give you an example, which is a really old example, but it's probably one which is still current for us, which is, imagine a poor man is starving. He can't find work, he's tried. He steals bread from a rich man's kitchen. It's something that the rich man will never, ever miss. The punishment for theft is really very severe. Should the law make an exception in this case? This is an example which is almost as old as moral philosophy, and it crystallizes the idea that even rules, even laws that we all accept, we all think that stealing is wrong, and yet there are some cases where we have a strong intuition, at least, that the rule should perhaps be bent or perhaps even broken. So this is a situation which, especially rules as laws, encounters over and over and over again in history. And this is a situation where, again, analogy plays an important role, because an exception is never just one exception. Mm-hmm. If you open the door by saying, in this one case, for the sake of some other concern, charity in the case of the poor man who has stolen bread for himself or his family, or a rule concerning when people may vote, for example, if we make an exception in this case, then it can be argued, then it's a precedent, and it can be argued by analogy in other cases. So there's always this danger whenever you make an exception that the exceptions will start to spread and that they will undermine the rule of law. And there's no simple answer to this. There's no meta rule that can tell you when to make an exception, only that sometimes an exception will be necessary. What seems to be important in stabilizing the rule of law when you do have to make an exception is that there be a public debate on an equal footing. And I'll explain what I mean by an equal footing. There are some theories of politics of the 20th century, most notably Carl Schmitt, the German theorist, who believes that what it means to be the sovereign, what it means to be the ruler, is to be able to declare an exception. And to be able to declare an exception only because you will it to be. You consult no one else has any power. That is a situation which is intended to completely blow up, to explode the rule of law. In order to have a situation in which reasoned exceptions are possible, people have to be empowered to have an equal voice in the deliberations. That seems to be the only guardrail to prevent, by analogy, precedents from undermining the rule of law.
Thank you. I think maybe it's time to open up for some questions from the audience. We have 10 minutes left. Anybody would like to ask some questions? Mercedes? Do you need a microphone? Would you like to speak through the microphone?
You've spoken. ¿Funciona?
No. No microphone.
Bueno, I'll speak loudly. You've spoken about reason and rationality and reason for decision making. My question is, could you please tell us a few words about the role of intuition? How intuition intervenes or is an ingredient for decision making, and to which point the acceptance of intuition is also cultural.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah, yeah. Okay, I can answer the first. The second is a really interesting question, and I may throw it back to you. So I think intuition might go back to expert judgment. I think of intuition as crystallized experience, and let me give an example of what I mean. When you start to play the piano, you're very conscious of where your fingers are. But as you get more and more expert at it, you no longer are conscious of where your fingers are. You are simply playing the music. And if you start to think about where your fingers are, you become confused. I think that's what happens with intuition. You have lots and lots of experiences which have been pushed below the threshold of consciousness. And most of the things that we do best, for example, riding a bicycle, or I often have this experience, my philosopher colleagues, I'll give this example, it's a very interesting example. I have a philosopher colleague at Chicago who, when he hears a talk, knows somehow, he doesn't know how, that there's a problem in the argument. So long before he can articulate and be conscious of what the problem is, I hear Jim next to me going, and I know that his intuition has told him there is a logical flaw in this argument, but he is not yet conscious. And that's a good example of how even the most conscious of ratiocinations, logic, can be intuitive, because he has so much experience in evaluating arguments that it is like the experienced pianist. Now, in terms of cultures which accept it more, so I'm going to put out a hypothesis, and I'd be interested in what you think. I think that people who live in cultures which require agility and dexterity to adapt to situations are probably cultures which accept intuitions more than cultures which believe that they have foreseen all eventualities and have a protocol for dealing with those eventualities. So I remember when my daughter was doing her fieldwork in India, visiting her in Delhi, and this is a culture where anything could happen at any moment. And these are people who are incredibly quick-witted, incredibly agile in adapting to new situations. And I would bet that there's a very high trust of intuition in that culture. But I'd be very interested if others have other views.
More questions? Or comments or remarks?
Hello. Just following that question, would you say that intuition, it's like our unconscious intelligence operating?
Yes, so
Some unconscious reason or something like that?
Yeah, I think so. Here's what I think it is. I think it starts off as conscious, and it starts off as quite laborious. And I think this is the case for all things that we do well, whichever skill. And the skill might be riding a bicycle, or it might be listening to a lecture. It might be evaluating a case at a court. And what happens with experience is that things that start off as conscious get pushed below the level of consciousness, and we call that intuition. And it raises a question, which is, if the things we do best, we do unconsciously, why do we have consciousness at all? Which is a question that really bothers many evolutionary psychologists. It's very expensive, this consciousness. Why do we have it?
I know some people who don't have much of a consciousness, but that's a very nice point. Yes, indeed. Javier.
Yeah, maybe I would like to ask you something. One of the most striking things about this book and another one called Against Nature is that you always refer to human rationality, perhaps implying that there are some other rationalities which are not human. And then my question is about that. It's about, not simply about artificial intelligence, but also about animal intelligence and animal rules. And I was wondering whether you could please say something about that. Do animals have rules as ours? Do they have this rationality you were discussing before? Well, thank you.
Yeah, what a wonderful question. So I do believe in the possibility of other intelligences. I think it was Kant who said in the first critique that he was absolutely certain that there was intelligent life on other planets, but that it would have, that these people, because they lived in a completely different environment, would have a completely different sensorium than we do. And if you have a different sensorium, you would have a different kind of reason. And I think that's true. And I think with regard to animal intelligence, there's a brilliant book by the philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith called Other Minds, which is about an octopus, the intelligence of octopus, which is phenomenal, but completely different from our intelligence. So I think the answer to the second part of your question is a categorical yes, exclamation point, and we're just on the threshold of trying to understand that. In terms of artificial intelligence, one puzzle I have is why so much of artificial intelligence has been aimed at trying to imitate what human beings already do well. So let me give an example. If you show a small child a picture, 3 or 4 pictures of an elephant, that child has got elephant. If the child sees a Babar book and a Babar is dressed up in evening clothes, the child recognizes it as an elephant. If the child sees an elephant in the zoo, the child can generalize and say it's an elephant. It takes 100,000 examples to teach a machine learning program to do the same thing. So the question is, why are we expending an enormous amount of resources to teach machine learning programs to do tasks which very small children master within perhaps 2 hours? And I think we should think about this. I don't mean this to denigrate artificial intelligence. I mean only that it's our first encounter with a form of alien intelligence that we have a possibility of understanding because we made it. And we seem hell-bent on forcing it into the mold of our own intelligence instead of figuring out what it does well that we do badly. So I remain with a question mark about this.
Thank you. Más preguntas, comentarios, sugerencias. Se puede también preguntar en español, ¿no? Una última pregunta.
Tenemos a la traductora,
Y se traduce rápidamente. ¿Tenemos 5 minutillos más para algunas preguntas más? Si alguien se anima.
I would just ask, following up with the intuition thing, because you were both of you talking about reason and rationality. You were giving the example of reasons to move to a new city. That will involve probably emotions and feelings. So what will be the role of emotions and feelings in human intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if one took the standpoint of evolution, one would have to believe that there is some kind of function for emotions. I realize that there's a long tradition in philosophy which opposes reason to the emotions. But that seems to me very short-sighted. Let me give an example. For example, anger. Anger is usually experienced in a situation in which we perceive injustice, either injustice toward ourselves or injustice toward others. That is an extremely important trigger to taking action to preserve a certain kind of social harmony, to preserve the kind of justice which is required to make social collectives cohere. So that's an example in which we don't deliberate when we get angry. It happens spontaneously, but it's not irrational in many cases to feel anger. It may be irrational to take certain actions rather than other actions on the basis of that, but the emotion itself has its own kind of reason to it. So I would not see I know there's a very long tradition of opposing reason and the passions, but I would not see them as fundamentally opposed.
Una pregunta más, quizá, todavía.
Hi, hello. So coming back to the thing of the intuition, I would like to ask you, what do you think? How can we make work the emotions on one side, and then the rationality on the other side? Because I think the same that you said, that we have been seeing both things as opposed, but I also believe that they shouldn't be opposed. We should use them as like an advantage for us. How do you think we can do that? Or if you don't think that we can do that?
No, I think it's a really good question. And again, let me give an example where I think rationality is important. So there have been many scientific studies of racial differences, gender differences, cultural differences. Many of these studies have been quite flawed because of the assumptions of the researchers who did the studies. What rationality can do in that case is to act as a way of putting limits on the emotions which fuel prejudice. So, for example, let us say that there is a hypothesis that men are better at mathematics than women are. It's really important in that kind of study to have a rational statistical protocol which will test for the significance of the effect, as to whether or not this is an effect which really is one which would bear further investigation, or whether or not it's simply a small amount of noise in the data. There are other cases in which we might worry, for example, about emotions getting out of hand. Let me give you another example, a very banal example, sports events. Sports events are occasions on which emotions run high, and they should run high, otherwise the event wouldn't be exciting. And yet we have, as the result of rationality, certain rules about what the sports fans can and cannot do in those situations. Those are cases where the emotions and rationality can work hand in hand. In a sense, the rules which prevent, for example, players at a football game from swarming the pitch are the preconditions for the emotions to be exercised at an exciting sports event.
Llegamos ya al final, me parece, de esta maravillosa sesión. We are coming to the end of this wonderful session. And we just want to thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you.
And we hope you have a lot of reasonable and intelligent exchanges and conversations while you're here in Spain with us. And we certainly love and enjoy very much talking to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.